Is your Skyline, GTR or RB swapped car suffering from a misfire? And are you about to ask a Facebook group to diagnose it for you over the internet? Well, we have a better option for you. Simply spin our wheel of misfire fortune. I don't think a day goes past that I don't see a Facebook group filled with the question, why is my RB misfiring? And usually with no evidence or any type of clue of what's causing it. Now in this episode of Motive's GTR and RB tuning guide, we're going to take a look at all the things that can cause a misfire in your RB engine and why you shouldn't be asking people on Facebook to diagnose it for you. We're going to look at all of the reasons that can cause a misfire, and there's a lot of them, and it proves why most people who are giving you an answer online are simply just spinning this wheel and taking a guess. And usually someone in the group, after you find the problem, will say, I told you so. Now, before we look at all the things that cause a misfire, what actually is a misfire? A misfire is when the air-fuel mixture is either burned incorrectly or not at all. Essentially, you're missing that combustion cycle and it gives you a missing sound from your engine. You may have heard it as rough running, as chugging, or you can just hear a hesitation in the engine while it's accelerating. And a lot of things can cause that misfire, and I'm sure many of you have heard it before. A misfire can be simplified down into two reasons. It either is an ignition-based misfire or it's an air-fuel mixture-based misfire. Now, with an ignition-based misfire, it's either the spark is too weak to ignite the air-fuel mixture properly, or there is no spark at all. While when it comes to the air-fuel mixture, essentially the issues you have is either it's too rich or too lean, or sometimes no fuel at all. And if you go down from that, you can see with ignition base, it can be plugs, coils, igniter, timing, and then below that, there's a whole bunch of more reasons as well that we'll get to. And when it's air fuel mixture based, essentially it's usually rich or lean, and that can be due to fuel delivery, changes to the tune based on a whole bunch of other issues, or it can be a mechanical issue. Now, before we get into the specifics of everything below all this, which is basically what causes a misfire in any engine, let's have a quick look at the most common issues you'll find in a GTR or an RB powered car. So the most common things that I would look for a misfiring GTR that's lightly tuned is, you ready? Dirty or broken airflow meters. Wastegate actuator having the vacuum line come off so it overboosts. A boost leak. Faulty or broken crank angle sensor. Wrong spark plugs or fouled spark plugs. Coil packs that are old, deteriorated or broken. Bad wiring, bad ground, broken igniter. A boost leak in the system. The paper gasket for the inlet manifold being deteriorated and broken. A blocked or fouled injector. They're the main ones that I would be looking for straight away. But there is a lot more things that can cause a misfire than that. Let's go take a look. So first up, let's start with probably the easiest thing you can change on your car to check for a misfire, and that is spark plugs. They seem really simple, but there is a lot to them. In fact, there's so much, it could be its own separate tech video. So first up with spark plugs, the common thing that causes a misfire is that they're fouled. Now that can be from a carbon buildup, which may be just as simple as the leftover in the combustion process over time. Sometimes that carbon buildup is also due to the car breathing. You can get an oil buildup to foul it. That's usually more things like you've got a broken ringland or a cracked cylinder head and a lot of oil is getting in there. Sometimes if a car breathes too much, it will just foul up plugs from oil. And another one is getting fouled due to fuel or a wet spark plug. That happens when you're getting lots of misfires and a lot of fuel in the cylinder, and it essentially just becomes a wet spark plug. The next one is it's either too old and deteriorated, or it's rusted. Now, how would it rust? Water in the cam valley. So common when people wash their car, water gets into the cam valley, and basically you end up with a rusted spark plug and it starts to deteriorate. If you pull your plug out and it looks like crap, it probably works like crap, is a bit of a golden rule. The next one is the plug can be damaged. Now, the insulator on it, the ceramic part, if that cracks and the spark can jump out of that part of the spark plug, it may not work. So you always check that the plug isn't damaged as well. I've also seen people like drop a spark plug and lower the plug gap or damage it in other ways, or the thread's damaged, etc. So look to make sure it's not damaged. Plug gap is a big one, and that's part of there being a need for a whole separate tech video. Now, the spark plug gap is the distance between the center electrode and the strap that you see. And basically, the bigger the gap, it's harder for the electrical charge to jump that gap. And if the gap's too small, sometimes it doesn't ignite the air fuel mixture correctly. So you can have too small a gap or too big a gap. What is the optimum gap? Well, that depends on a lot of things. The plug design, how strong your ignition system is in terms of the energy delivered in that spark, how much boost you're running, the fuel that you're running. Like I said, a whole nother video. This video is just designed to tell you what could be causing your misfire. We're not going to go into all of the specifics on spark plugs. The next one that is a really interesting topic is the heat range of the spark plug. A lot of people don't understand that you can have a hot plug, a cold plug, and anywhere in the middle. Why would you change the temperature range of your plug, and what determines that? Well, if you look in the middle of a spark plug and you see basically how deep that ceramic section goes, and it's to do with the transfer of heat. In other words, how quickly that heat escapes the spark plug. When you're modifying your RB and you start making more power, you go to a colder plug. Now, here's the thing, it gets even more confusing, is the temperature range on spark plugs changes for each manufacturer. Now, in an NGK plug, the higher the number, the colder the plug. But if you go to a different brand of spark plug, the higher the number, the hotter the plug. And the numbers aren't the same between each brand. That's why the heat range is such a difficult sort of one answer for all of it, is because it changes for every spark plug. And the best thing you do is talk to your tuner, someone with experience of what plug they know works in the application of your build. The next one is having the wrong design of spark plug. And what I mean by that is copper, iridium, platinum plugs, etc. Some basic cars, copper plugs are perfectly fine. A lot of modern cars need an iridium or platinum plug. So the design of the plug. The next one is resistor. Now, when you see the R in the letter designation for some of these spark plugs, the R stands for resistor. Why would that be important? Well, little side story. I once put non-resistor spark plugs into a car. It was on the dyno, kept misfiring. But it was weird because it was more of a trigger error issue. And what we found out was the non-resistor spark plug was causing an electrical interference to the ECU that made it misfire. So you have to have a resistor spark plug in 99% of applications. So as you can see, just spark plugs is a massive topic of why your car might be misfiring, and we should probably do our own separate tech video on it. The next main culprit for a misfire is the coil packs. What do coil packs do? They store the electrical energy in this coil, and then when it's time to send that through the spark plug, which is your ignition timing, it is then released. Now, the first thing with a coil pack is you could have a damaged stalk. Now, as they get old, they can deteriorate, and another big problem is getting water inside. So that's why a lot of old stalks tend to fail. The stalk is basically how it gets from the coil to the spark plug. The glorious R35 coil. The problem with the stalk in these that you'll see is as you pull it apart, there's a resistor inside. Some people, when they change the stalks, they lose that resistor and it doesn't work. And the other part is the spring. That can deteriorate, snap, break, fall out, get lost, all sorts of different things. So that's something to look out for if you've got aftermarket coil packs. When you pull them apart, don't lose the spring and the resistor, and make sure they go back in correctly. So what goes wrong with the coil pack itself? Probably the biggest thing that goes wrong with them is they're old.
Too old!
I often find with the GTR that if you were to put stock coils back in, it would handle a lot more power than you think. But here's the thing, why would you put a stock coil back in when you can put an R35 coil in, which can handle way more power than this, is more reliable and easily available? I've seen 1,000 horsepower from stock coils with an aftermarket igniter, because the stock coils don't have an igniter built in. They have a separate igniter. So basically, being old is the main reason they deteriorate and get damaged. You get water in them as well. So many times people wash their engine bay, or they've got a valley cover and rain gets in, water gets in these, damages them, and you get a misfire. In fact, I can't even express how many times I've seen cleaning your engine bay or rain through a bonnet vent causing a misfire in an RB. It's probably the number one offender. Another thing to look at, more specifically with the R35, is the settings in your ECU. You have to get the correct dwell setting. Too much dwell, or how long the charge time is, and it will get too hot. Too hot could cause a misfire or damage it. And not enough dwell timing in here obviously does the opposite, which is not enough spark energy to work. So the dwell settings in your ECU are very important, and so many times I've seen that cause a misfire when using R35 coils. The next one to look at is wiring. First one is, it's also old and junk and needs to be thrown in the bin. Essentially, the factory wiring has had so many heat cycles it starts to deteriorate, fall apart, and you can have misfires just purely due to one wire earthing out somewhere or being broken. The plugs can get old. Using them a lot can make them have the clip snap off or a pin inside break. They can get water in them and rust. So the wiring itself is very important. When you go to an aftermarket ECU and aftermarket coil, another big problem is power and ground. My advice is, if you're putting in an R35 coil, put a fresh wiring loom in, which PRP do provide with their kits as well as many others. And the other thing you want to do is provide a fresh voltage source to the coil. Now, rather than taking voltage out of the ECU, it might be running short on amperage. Give the coils their own power source direct from the battery via relay, obviously, so that you get good power to the coil. And the other problem is not enough ground. Let me show you something funny. Do you remember these from the early 2000s and the 90s, these earthing kits? The reason these were invented is to get a better ground, and one of the areas they wanted to ground was the coil packs, so that you got a better ignition system. They were pretty common, but god damn it, they're ugly. So this one is going to be an ornament on our shelf from HKS, because we've learnt since these days how to wire things and do things better. I mentioned it before and I'll say it again, the connectors are a problem. If you muck around with the connectors too much, break the wiring in the end, they crack and break like this one has, the connector can be a problem. And another big one for coils is heat soak. I've seen so many times R35 coils or another brand of coil go into a GTR, you put the valley cover on, and they're not designed to be inside a valley like that. They're designed to be above an engine. They get too much heat soak and you get a misfire. That's just purely the coil is just too hot. And I've seen that many, many times. You start driving the car to begin with, you don't have a misfire, you've been driving it for half an hour, suddenly you've got a misfire out of nowhere for no reason. That's quite often due to heat soak of the coil pack. Now, the last thing to look at in this sort of the main part of the ignition system is the igniter. What's the igniter? It's this thing, sits at the back of the valley of the RB26. These fail when they're old. And guess what? They're all old. So you don't need this anymore when you go to an R35. Each coil has an inbuilt igniter, and some people upgrade these to like an HKS twin spark system and things like that. So the igniter basically just gets old and you want to throw it in the bin. The next reason for a misfire that's to do with spark is ignition timing. And sometimes one step further from ignition timing is having the incorrect ignition signal. Now, what I mean by that is, if it's running too retarded in the ignition timing, it generally just heats up the manifold and loses power and is sluggish, but it probably won't misfire. But if you sort of go so far that it fires at completely the wrong time, like not even in the window of being able to fire, that can cause a misfire. So in other words, your ignition timing is just completely off, probably due to a faulty signal. The other thing is it can go so lean that it starts to get detonation, which, as you know, destroys your engine. But if you get detonation that bad, the detonation can lead to a misfire as well. Now, why would you have the wrong ignition timing or a wrong signal? Bad tuning could be the first one. Now, a big one with the RB26 is this, the factory cam angle sensor. It's rubbish, and you can see it has an optical disc inside it. This can flex, move around. There's a lot of little slots in here, so it doesn't always capture every signal correctly. They get old, they fail, they go intermittent. I have seen these cause misfires many times. Now, some of you are going to say, but my factory CAS got tuned to 700 wheel horsepower. So did mine, mate. Just because it can do it doesn't mean it's the best way to do it. What you often find with a factory CAS, you can tune it to 700, 800, even 1,000 horsepower, but you have to tune around it. It means you can't get the most out of the car. So let's just say we have any hypothetical ignition timing, we might have to pull 2 degrees out of it to stay the buffer with one of these so that it doesn't jump around, because you'll often find these jump around in terms of the ignition timing. Sometimes they get a dropped signal, so then you get a miscount on your ECU, which can then obviously cause a misfire. So the factory CAS should do this. You ready? Bin. Oh, what a great sound that was. Okay, so if you get rid of the factory cast, you're going to go to a crank trigger and cam trigger setup, which can lead to some other issues. If you get the spacing of those sensors incorrect, then you can start getting miscounts, which leads to a misfire. You can have a dirty or a damaged sensor. A lot of these trigger kits, you'll see the sensor is quite exposed. You might get oil on the end of the sensor, leaves, debris, etc. I've seen it happen. The other thing is the wiring can get damaged while it's in the engine bay, not done correctly. So essentially, the sensor itself can either be done wrong or damaged. Another thing we see is temperature sensor correction. If you have a temperature sensor that's reading incorrectly, it'll give the wrong signal to the ECU and change the tune, which can lead to a misfire. Another thing that I've seen, which is not so common but happens, is if your car overheats and it goes into limp mode and you don't know it has a limp mode, sometimes you just get a misfire and you go, why is my car misfiring? And it's just in limp mode because it's too hot. So having sensors and knowing your car well can obviously avoid things like that. And obviously if you have a cam belt that slips, it can change your ignition timing. If you adjust the cast incorrectly, it can change your ignition timing. So basically anything to do with ignition timing or the signal to the ECU for the ignition timing can cause a misfire. So you can see so far that just spark, we've covered over 20 things. So there is a lot to look at just on the spark side of a misfire. But the most common things you're ever going to find with your RB26 is fouled plugs, wrong heat range or gapped on your plugs, the stalks and coil packs having water in them or just being old, and the igniter failing or just having your CAS fail or set up wrong. They're kind of like the main issues you'd get on a run-of-the-mill GTR, as opposed to every option it could be when things start to get modified and change. So a misfire is either caused by spark or air-fuel mixture, which is what we're going to talk about now. Now, when I say the air-fuel mixture, I basically mean what is inside the cylinder during the combustion process, which is supposed to be air and fuel. But sometimes water and oil get in there as well, and it affects that overall mixture. Now, when we break it down, we've got fuel delivery, tune, and mechanical reasons for what could change the air-fuel mixture to be incorrect and cause a misfire. Essentially, you get a rich misfire or a lean misfire or a misfire due to the fact that there just isn't any fuel at all in the cylinder. And obviously, if there's no fuel, it can't fire. So we'll look at fuel delivery first. So the first culprit is the fuel pump. Now, if the fuel pump is old or starting to fail, you'll just find that as power goes up, it can't keep up with the demand. The car leans out, develops a lean misfire. The other thing that can also happen that you need to keep in the back of your head is if you get low fuel pressure and you've got a good tuner and a good ECU, guess what happens? You go into limp mode, an artificial rev limiter that's lower, that'll feel like a misfire. Now, the other thing that can also affect the fuel pump is wiring and voltage. Nissans are old, the voltage to the pump is always terrible, and I tell everyone in your GTR or your Silvia or your Skyline, rewire the factory fuel pump first to see if that helps you get a little bit more fuel for you, because they don't always get 14 volts. The fuel filter, another big culprit. It gets blocked. What would cause it to get blocked? Rusty fuel tank is a big culprit. When the fuel sits for a long time as well. Obviously, plastic tank in a GTR means it's not. And sometimes, if you don't have the right fuel filter sock in the tank or the right fuel lines, E85 can gum things up and get them blocked. Have seen that many, many times. What happens if your fuel filter's blocked? You don't get enough fuel to the engine, it starts to lean out, get a misfire. The next one is fuel lines. Not really a common thing, but getting blocked is pretty rare, but sometimes your fuel lines are just too small if you've done upgrades. The next thing to go wrong is a fuel pressure regulator. Now, I don't generally see a factory fuel pressure regulator just fail. The problem they usually have is they're too small for your fuel system and can't handle the fuel flow. In other words, you might not be able to get the pressure down enough and you run too rich. But the main thing I see go wrong with a fuel pressure regulator is the vacuum hose to the top of it, which pushes boost or vacuum onto the diaphragm. That can either split or come off. Now, that's a big problem, because the way that a rising rate fuel pressure regulator works, quick bit of science here is, if your base pressure is 40 psi, what happens when you add boost pressure to the inlet manifold? It fights against the fuel pressure. So you need the fuel pressure to go up with boost pressure. So let's just do a quick graph. Let's just say it goes to 20 psi of boost here, 0 here. It's going to end up intersecting here. So the fuel pressure should look like that. So at any given time when you're looking at your data logs, your fuel pressure should always be base pressure plus fuel pressure. So if that line comes off and you lose fuel pressure, you will go really lean and things will go really bad. Now, another thing that can cause you to go lean or have no fuel at all is a blocked injector. What would cause a blocked injector? Debris going through an engine could hit it. E85 could gum it up and block it, or it's just old and rusty and deteriorated. Sometimes cars that sit for a long time get a sticky injector. Now, if you have a blocked or sticky injector, it will affect how much fuel ends up into your engine. And the last one we're going to look at is tank location. Now, let's have a little side story about that one, shall we? When I first put the RB30 into my Skyline GTR, I went to a mechanical fuel pump. PRP has a mechanical fuel pump that you fit on the cam. Now, that's a little bit different to the usual drag racing style of having it down low or putting it at the back of the car. Now, initially, I had my fuel tank in the back of the car. And what happened is on the dyno, the car ran perfect. But I went to the track and I'd get just a light misfire. So I looked at all the logs. Air-fuel ratio looked perfect. Fuel pressure at first glance looked perfect, and I couldn't find anything wrong in the car. I even put it back on the dyno, couldn't find a misfire anywhere. Back to the track, very, very small misfire. So what I did is I zoomed in on the fuel pressure, and this is what I saw. So let's just say that's where you want your fuel pressure to be. If I zoomed right in, I'm talking milliseconds, the fuel pressure was doing this. And I had an oscillation in fuel pressure. And whenever it either reached a rich or a lean point due to that fuel pressure, I'd get a little misfire. Not a big one, just a little bit. And I'm like, what is causing this? And I worked out what was happening is under acceleration, the G-force was fighting against the fuel in the fuel line, and I wasn't getting the right fuel pressure, and it was oscillating. So to fix it, I moved the surge tank for the mechanical fuel pump from the back of the car to the front of the car, and the misfire went away. That was a really difficult one to find because he couldn't get it on the dyno. But you've got to ask yourself this: if the car is perfect on the dyno, but it has a misfire in the real world, the usual culprits are some type of heat soak, G-force affecting the car, or if you're not getting it to a higher gear, sometimes time is causing an issue because one dyno run versus multiple gears. So if you are getting a misfire that's not on the dyno in the real world, you've got to start looking at those small things to try and narrow down what it could be. And in my case, it was simply just having the right data, zooming right in, because when you zoomed out, it looked flat. It was only oscillating a little bit. Air-fuel ratio looked clean because that's obviously down in the dump pipe. So unless it was lean all over, I just didn't see that change in air-fuel ratio. So data looked good. Oscillation in fuel pressure caused the misfire. So yeah, this is why logging and data and sensors are so important in a modified car. The next thing to look at is tune. Now, to get a misfire from tune, you either get a rich misfire or a lean misfire. Now, a rich misfire generally just fouls up the plug from having unburnt fuel in there and doesn't really cause any damage as per se. You'd need a lot of fuel to start causing damage. But a lean misfire is very bad. Why? Well, you're going to get detonation, you're going to melt spark plugs, melt pistons, break ringlet. There's all sorts of things you're going to do damage-wise if you have a lean misfire. So that's the one you're trying to avoid. Now, I'd like to think that every tuner out there can get the car the correct tune air-fuel ratio-wise on the dyno. Some guys might go a little bit too rich to be a little bit safer, but here's the thing. What happens on the dyno, what happens in the real world aren't always the same. The load on the car. Now, a big thing that I see is a car tuned on an inertia drum style dyno with no load, and it just basically comes on and quickly ramps up. But when it goes out onto a runway, drag strip, the street, they hold that gear for a lot longer. There's more load on the engine, it leans out and it blows up. So you do need to look at whether or not the tune that you do on the dyno is going to match up to on the street, and that is a big problem. The other thing that also happens between the dyno in a perfect world and out in the real world is temperature correction. That can be correction due to increased coolant temperature or oil temperature. If you've got a really hot oil or water temp, the car might go into limp mode on the ECU, which gives you a misfire. And going back to what I said before, obviously, hot water. It's going to lead to heat soak in the engine, which is going to lead to heat soak on the coils, and you're going to get a misfire from that. But what the main thing with temperature correction is intake air temperature correction. Now, one big problem we have with the GTR is the factory intake air temp sensor suffers from heat soak around it from the inlet manifold, and it's very slow to respond. Now, here's the thing. Now, imagine your car's heat soak. You've been driving around for an hour. Get onto the highway. You now got some airflow going through it, but it isn't reading the cooler intake air temp yet. You roll on to boost. You get this big rush of air through the intercooler. It does its job. It cools the air down, but the intake air temperature sensor is still reading like 60 degrees intake air temp or more, because of the heat soak that it has, but the actual intake air temp might only be 40 degrees Celsius. Now, because the ECU thinks you've got 60-degree intake air temps, it's changing the tune to suit that. It's pulling fuel out because the air's less dense. But now you've got this cold air coming in, and what happens? It leans out. Probably feels fast for a little bit, but then what happens after it feels fast? It's always fastest before it blows up. So temperature correction with the intake air temp is a big problem. And that's obviously got to do with the heat soak as well. So we like to switch to a fast response intake air temp sensor so that you get an accurate intake air temp reading. And I have seen this happen a lot. Now, the next thing that can cause a lean misfire generally is just cool conditions. Firstly, boost pressure on a cold night. Ever driven your car on like a freezing cold night? You're like, man, this rips. It's probably running more boost. Now, here's the thing. If it's not tuned for it correctly, that extra boost, especially with factory airflow meters, won't reach a boost cut, lean out and blow up. Ask me how I know. The other thing that can happen as well is if you have a boost cut, it'll keep hitting that boost cut and that will feel like a misfire. That'll more happen with an aftermarket ECU and other cars. Factory GTR does not have boost cut, which is very, very bad. So I've seen a lot of cars hit boost cut and think it's a misfire on a cold night. The other thing is the density of the air now is so much better. There's more oxygen in it. So what happens to your tune? Well, if you haven't done the temperature correction properly, you've now got this really cold air coming in, and guess what? She starts to lean out, so you get a lean misfire. And the other thing that can change the tune is basically damaged sensors or wiring. Now, that's more of a diagnostic thing. Like you might have a sensor that's broken, damaged, or wiring that's damaged. Just basically creates the wrong signal to the ECU, which will then change the tune and lead to a misfire. Factory airflow meters can be a very big problem in some of these circumstances. The main one is that the factory airflow meter on RB26 can essentially max out. There is only so much voltage range it has as the air flows over the sensor inside for its diameter. That is why people upgrade to a Z32 airflow meter when they put a Power FC into a GTR. So I've seen people on a cold night with stock airflow meters, they max out the airflow meter. Now, what happens when you max out the airflow meter? The ECU now literally has no idea what to do. So it's not adding any more fuel or anything at all above that point. So what happens? It goes lean, your engine goes bang. The end. And the other thing with GTRs is they don't have a boost cut. So if your vacuum line comes off, you get a really cold night and it runs a heap of extra boost, it won't stop it. It'll just let it go. This is why the factory ECU and airflow meters in a Skyline GTR belong, that's right, they belong in the bin. So the last topic to cover is mechanical issues. This is where something breaks and it then leads to a change in the air-fuel mixture. So first one up is a boost or a vacuum leak. Now, if you have factory airflow meters, any boost or vacuum leak is going to cause an issue. Why is that? Well, the airflow meter measures the amount of air going into the engine. If that changes between there and getting to the engine, the ECU doesn't know, therefore it changes the tune. One big one is where people don't block off where the blow-off valves go back into the air intake, so more air gets sucked in after the airflow meter. And the thing that happens when you have a boost leak after the turbocharger, if you can imagine you're now losing air out of the system, ECU doesn't know, it now has too much fuel, you get a rich misfire, and you get really bad fuel economy, and you lose power. You can also get a vacuum leak on the inlet manifold after the throttle body. Very common in these for the inlet manifold gasket to deteriorate. Once it does that, you have a vacuum leak. You usually get a misfire at idle, but it might be okay under boost sometimes because the leak isn't that bad. So looking for vacuum leaks and boost leaks can be another thing for a misfire. Let's get on to more, how can I put it? Probably the things people don't think of. First one is a popped shim. When do you pop shims? Well, normally when it's someone like me, it's because you're running 35-pounder boost with just aftermarket valve springs, drop-in cams, and a stock bottom end. I actually popped a shim maybe 3 or 4 times. RPM and rev limiter usually do it. But what happens when the shim pops out of the top of the valve retainer, it gets wedged between the bucket, so the valve never closes properly. Now, often what happens with a pop shim, you have a miss at idle, and you have a miss when you're cruising. But you get on a full noise, and sometimes it actually feels okay. I've had 3 pop shims at the same time before. Car had 0 compression in 3 cylinders. Everyone thought the car was dead. It was 3 pop shims. So with a pop shim, you'll find you have no compression when you do a compression test, but when it drives under boost, sometimes it actually feels fine under boost. So not always, but quite often it does. So a pop shim is a big one for a misfire. A bent valve can cause a misfire because if the valve's not closing, it's leaking, changes the air-fuel mixture, you have a misfire at idle. I've seen people chase a bent valve a lot. Compression check is your friend when it comes to looking for these things. Here's a really interesting one. Lifting the head can cause a misfire. Now, people think when you lift the head, you just pressurize the cooling system, but here's the thing. The only time it's pressurizing the cooling system is obviously when the combustion cycle is happening, and that's what's lifting up the head. But the cylinder next to it's on a different stroke, right? So what happens is the lifted head can let water into a cylinder during the intake stroke, and then it's stuck in there for the compression stroke. Now you've got water trapped in with your air-fuel mixture. That changes it, and what happens? You get a misfire. Now, RBs lift the head in the mid-range. They basically just stretch the head stud, the deck moves around, they just lift the head. I've had it when I've had a stock head gasket and studs. I did it with a stock bottom end. I've lifted the head when I had a built head but stock bottom end. And I've lifted the head with the RB32 because, well, that's just what happens when you run a normal style head gasket and make 1200 horsepower. So the example of the lifted head that I'm going to refer to is when we ran the 8.6 second pass in our R32, we'd wicked it up compared to what it ran on the street. Normally we have like a progressive boost curve, don't have a lot of mid-range, but because the track could hold the power, we upped the mid-range boost. Now the first pass of the day didn't misfire. What happens with a lifting head, heat soak makes it worse. So what happened is by the time we did our 3rd pass of the day and we got into 5th gear, we developed a misfire in 5th gear, which you can listen to in this pass. So that misfire was due to a lifted head, water getting into the cylinder. Now, when the car cooled down and I took it for another drive, the first hit, it didn't misfire. But here's the thing, I went to World Time Attack on 1,000 horsepower, didn't lift the head, no misfire. Then I had to turn it up, right? So I turned it up to the 1150, 1200, we ran the 8.6 on. First pass, okay. Next pass, misfire. And then for some stupid reason, I decided to do 2 more passes. And by the 4th pass, the misfire was so bad I couldn't stay into it. So the heat soak associated with the lifted head is what made it worse and worse and worse, to the point where I couldn't even drive it. The next mechanical issue, similar to a lifted head, is a cracked head. Now, I've seen someone crack a head and water and or oil, depending on where the crack is, gets into the cylinder. If you get oil and water into the cylinder, it changes the air-fuel mixture and you can get a lean or a rich misfire. Now, broken ringland is a similar thing. Once you break a ringland or even the blow-by, if you have excessive blow-by in an old engine, you can now get so much oil into the cylinder from blow-by that you can start to foul up the plugs and have a misfire. The other thing that can happen is if the engine's breathing really heavily and it doesn't have a catch can that breathes through atmosphere, you can then get a bunch of oil through the inlet tract, which can also foul things up. So broken ringland, lots of blow-by. And the last one, a bent rod. If your con rod is bent, the piston won't go as high in the cylinder. Now, what happens then is the compression is lower and it's getting too much fuel, but because your wideband O2 sensor is measuring an average of all 6 cylinders, it doesn't know. So now you've got way too much fuel in that one cylinder. That one cylinder gets a rich misfire and you sit there scratching your head on why. So mechanical issues like this can lead to a misfire. So there you have it. There's over 50 reasons your RB, your GTR, or probably even any engine can be misfiring, and there's probably other reasons that cause misfires that are particular to other engines. Now, we're not here teaching you how to diagnose the misfire because just like we said, I can't diagnose your misfire over the internet. I don't know what it's doing. I can't see the data. Speaking of data, that's the most important thing when it comes to diagnosing a misfire. If you have a factory ECU or you have an aftermarket ECU with no sensors or logging, etc., trying to fix it on the road is just a guess. Get it on a dyno. I've watched so many people either crash or cause damage to their car as they fix or replace one thing at a time, trying to see what the misfire is, and they break the car in the process. Put it on a dyno and you'll find it quickly by putting sensors on the car. If you have an aftermarket ECU, have as many sensors in the car as you can. Obviously, wideband AFR is a very important one, fuel pressure, but have oil temp, oil pressure, also have coolant temperature. Coolant pressure is even a good one to see if you're lifting the head. EGTs are even better, so you can see discrepancies between all of the cylinders, and have logging. And that way, if you have a misfire, you can send the log to your tuner, you can narrow it down, look for the misfire that you had in the log, and try and see what's causing it. If your data logs aren't showing you what's going on, other than changing the spark plugs or the coils, you probably need to get it on a dyno anyway, which is going to lead me to a little side story. So I had a 180SX that had upgraded fuel pump, intercooler exhaust, pod filter, all the basics, but had stock airflow meter, stock ECU. Now we'd sorted the car out, driven it, tested it, driven it, totally fine. It sat for a little while. I got it back, went for a drive and it misfired. I'm like, oh, God damn it. So I did the usual. I changed the plugs. Now I had spare coil packs, spare igniter, so I changed those. Didn't fix it. I'm like, man, this thing had a new pump and filter. It can't be that. So what do I do next? I change the airflow meter because I had one, and then I even changed the entire inlet manifold. Nothing made the misfire go away. I checked everything, boost leaks, the whole lot. And I'm like, oh, God damn it. And my brain kept saying, no, the pump and filter, they're fine because I changed those. It must be that. So then I took it to Croydon, put it on the dyno, put a fuel flow meter on it. And what happened? As soon as it came on boost, fuel flow meter went down. We knew it's fuel delivery straight away. I changed the pump. Still a problem. Because I thought there's no way a 1-month-old filter is a problem. And guess what it was? It was the fuel filter. So after a week of mucking around, a rusty tank caused a blocked fuel filter that had already been changed a month ago. So whenever you go to check a car over like that, don't just assume something you fixed earlier is still fixed and is not the problem. And a dyno found it, we hadn't even gone past 3,000 RPM. The fuel pressure or fuel flow gauge just went down. Now here's the thing. If I had a aftermarket ECU with a fuel pressure sensor, I would have looked in the logs and seen fuel pressure go down. I would have gone, that is a fuel delivery issue. And I would have found it quickly. But because I had a factory ECU, factory airflow meter, no sensors, no nothing, I needed a dyno. So that's I guess is probably the key way to look at this. Either have sensors and logging or go on a dyno. That is the safest way to do it. Obviously, checking plugs is a quick and easy thing to do to see if that's causing the issue for a light misfire that you may have developed. But think about this. If you developed a misfire and the car was fine, think about things that might change. Now, plugs are the most common thing that will change due to build-up, etc., while heat soak is the other thing. So I'm not going to sit here and teach you how to diagnose your car from front to back, but I just want you guys to understand how many things can cause a misfire, that it's dangerous to go and change it and test hits on the road non-stop trying to get rid of it, and you could damage your engine in the process. So if you can get to a dyno, do it. If not, sensors, logging, and an aftermarket ECU are your friend. So we hope you've learned a lot from this. And as you can see, there's about 10 other topics we might do a deep dive on later. Hope you enjoyed this RB and GTR tuning guide. Make sure you subscribe, like, comment, share, all of those things. The more views we get, the more of these we can make.